Right behind me here, just behind this arch, was Murphy's Lane. And further down, almost at the back here of what is the De La Salle or Stephen Street Monastery, was Ushers Arch. They were probably the two worst lanes in Waterford, insofar as both on health terms regarding the times of fever and cholera, almost everyone, without exception, would get the fever. In other places, maybe 10%, maybe 20%. Now, these weren't corporation-owned houses. These were owned by private individuals. Many city councillors would have owned these. And because there was no incentive in the landlord's minds to do them up, Murphy's Lane was particularly bad. But in living memory, Ushers Arch was there, and we had guys with very colourful names like Kate, the Queen of Ushers Arch, Pat the Lad, Francis Menton, and these were notorious characters around town. Notorious for many things, for prostitution, and particularly for drunkenness. You would always invariably see every week on the police court, you would see people from Murphy's Lane and from Ushers Arch in the courts, mainly because of drinking and that. But the living conditions were absolutely horrendous. You know, probably well, they wouldn't have been, as we would know it, toilets that would flush. Indeed, in many of the houses, there may not have been any toilets at all. Particularly if there was tenements around the area, there's probably no toilet whatsoever. So people would quite literally have to dump their pots or their chamber pots out the window. And that was it. It was a horrific sight, horrific time. It certainly wasn't the good old days. That was Murphy's Lane. Canon Power wrote about it. Donovan, the guy who went along and did the Griffiths valuation, wrote about it and put down personal notes that you go in one end, but you wouldn't come out the other end. It was very, very bad. Very, very violent society, probably because of the drinking. You know, and it would be all whiskey, it wouldn't be beer, it would be whiskey. The town would have been full of cheap whiskey shops, and the reason they were so cheap is because if you had a good pub, you paid more taxes. So the worst type of pub you had, the less taxes you paid. And I said it was just a notorious place for whiskey drinking. Well, Murphy's Lane would have existed perhaps from the 1700s, maybe the early 1800s. Ushers Arch a little bit later, but Ushers Arch lived on into the 20th century, perhaps the 1930s or 1940s. Ushers Arch would have closed. And when the public housing schemes around the city began to open up, they would have been housed there. And a very important thing to note is that the first public housing in Ireland was in Waterford around the 1880s, and that was St. Joseph Terrace up in Green Street. However, the rents were fairly high, even though it was a council corporation establishment, and only tradesmen could have afforded that. Like the poor people that live down here in this area and into tenements, there's no way could they afford it. Tenements would have been large houses. You would have had them all over the place. You would have had an Alexander Street. You would have had them, you know, when the gentry, so to speak, vacated the city, and it became, well, the population of Waterford was always fairly constant, you know, between 26,000 up to 30,000, and that was like that up into the 20th century, you know, well into the middle 20th century. So they would have lived in these, and if somebody vacated a room, and it was a fairly big room, another family would move in and they might get a bigger room, and that's the way people went. So a lot of people lived, but the cottages, as they were known,